Join Harvey, Levin, and Mark Geragos for this week's episode of Two Angry Men, where they break down the Celeste Rivas David case and all of the stunning new developments that have popped up. Enjoy.
The DA, clearly she thinks David did this, but there were more than one or more than two people who had some knowledge of it. A circle around David knew various things. By land and by sea, welcome to Two Angry Men. Mark, we have a lot to talk about because the DA is closing in on somebody, and I believe two people who are very close to David, the singer who is a suspect in the murder of Celeste Rivas. And the DA is having a hard time, by all accounts, getting the information she wants. They are before the grand jury. It is a secret session, but there is a hallway there, and it's a public hallway. And we have somebody who was in the public hallway actually for something else, but voices carried. And we heard a guy named Robert Morgenroth, who is the general manager of Mogul Vision, which is the record company for David. But more important, he is the day-to-day manager of David. He handles his life. And we heard Morgenroth talk to his lawyer after he was in one of the grand jury sessions, saying that the DA got very pushy, trying to find out why I didn't call the police. And he said he responded to her. He didn't think it was her responsibility, that his job was to make sure the tour kept going. Well, you only call the police when there's evidence of a crime. So it sounds like the DA believes that Morgenroth knows something that's connected to a crime. And the only crime that's before the grand jury right now is the death of Celeste Rivas.
And by the way, they're exactly right. They're not talking about moving somebody after death or postmortem or anything else. And when you talk about the scuttlebutt on that 13th floor is that Beth, who is the prosecutor out of Major
Beth Silverman.
Beth Silverman is, I mean, she is ferocious, number one, but her energy has infected, I'm told by secondhand, that the witnesses are saying the grand jurors are engaged. There is two grand jurors in particular who are lit up by Beth. Beth's energy is infectious in there. It's like nothing I've ever heard of in a grand jury right now. It is wild what is happening. Mind you, earlier people were talking about this as, and I think the LA Times even reported it as an investigative grand jury. If this is an investigative grand jury, it is the most aggressive grand jury I've ever heard of.
It does not feel like an investigative grand jury. Morgenroth testified for at least 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And he may have testified sometime the week earlier as well. But he must be a critical witness. Now, it's really interesting, Mark, because Robert Morgenroth is a co-manager of David. The other person who manages him is a guy named Josh Marshall. Josh Marshall is the guy who rented the house that David lived in. Remember, that's the house that the LAPD executed a search warrant on and took stuff out after Celeste's body was found. So we're told that house figures prominently in this investigation. So Josh Marshall, who rented the house, is the co-manager with Robert Morgenroth, who is, we're told, David's day-to-day manager. So I don't know if Josh Marshall has testified, but they clearly think that Morgenroth is a key witness. And I got to tell you one other thing, and help me out here.
Morgenroth must be testifying under a grant of immunity. And one of the problems, I think, from the just piecing all of this together, is that they don't like some of the stuff he's saying under the grant of immunity. And remember, a grant of immunity kind of cloaks you in this idea that they can't come after you unless they don't believe you.
Well, I don't know if there is a grant of immunity. You may be right, but then help me out on this. That my reporter who was in the hallway on Wednesday saw Morgan Roth and his lawyer walk into an adjacent courtroom. This is a courtroom that has been hearing contempt motions, but also, I believe, is connected to the grand jury. Then the DA, Beth Silverman, walks in as well. And our reporter walks in the courtroom and they kick her out because they're saying whatever it is private. So it's got to be something connected with the grand jury. And it's feeling to me, it's really feeling to me, and I'll get into this in a bigger way in a moment, but it's feeling to me like Beth isn't getting what she wants out of Morgan Roth, and she's asking the judge to lay down the law.
This is what happens procedurally. You're on the 13th floor. You've got your people on the 13th floor there. Department 100, Department 123, the grand jury, all of them are right in a row there on the 13th floor. 123 is where they've been dragging people into because the grand jury is presided over either by the judge in 100 or the judge in 123. When they're kicking the public out, that's because they're talking about grand jury secret stuff. Now, mind you, one of the misnomers of the grand jury is that somehow the witnesses can't talk. Witnesses can talk. In fact, that's how a lot of this stuff is getting to you or getting to me. What's happening is when they march somebody into Department 123, it almost always revolves around the fact that there's been a judicial grant of immunity, because if you're a lawyer, criminal defense lawyer, the last thing you want is to not have the judicial blessing. And you said that you're overhearing stuff in the hallway. If there's a lawyer there and the lawyer's worth anything, the lawyer has already insisted on immunity. They're going in there. Knowing Beth, as long as I've known Beth, she's over there. She's not buying what somebody is selling, or somebody's not singing from the script she was led to believe. Because before you give immunity as a DA, you do a proffer. You tell them, either you, meaning the witness, or the lawyer tells them, this is what I expect them to testify to, because you're not buying the proverbial pig in a poke.
Are you saying that you think he has immunity but isn't living up to the deal and she's pissed off?
I think that there is an immunity deal in place. Otherwise, he would not be testifying in there, and that she is dragging him down there because either she doesn't like the answer she's getting, or he's not complying with the terms of the immunity agreement. With one or the other. They're not dragging him in. If somebody's in front of the grand jury and has been there for a couple of days, and from what I'm told, grand jurors are actively engaged. And if that is the case, and the witness is resistant, or the witness is not saying the kinds of items or complying with what the DA was led to believe, that's when you drag them down there. And by the way, there's also been this crazy stuff that has been posted about witnesses getting papers with scribbles on it, go to Department 123 and things of that nature, which frankly, I've never even seen before. And I don't even know if it's potentially true, but I do know from what's been reported and what I've heard is that witnesses and the grand jurors are at a heightened state of engagement.
Well, I got to tell you, this does not feel like an investigative grand jury. We are shooting this right now, you and me, on Friday afternoon. And my reporter was in the hallway and heard a couple of grand jurors just saying to each other, have a great holiday. And it sounds like they may be taking a break. I don't know this, but I'm trying to connect the dots, that they may be taking a break for Christmas and then coming back the first of the year. And that aligns with something else that my reporter heard, because he heard Morgan Roth's lawyer, her name is
Evan Janess.
Evan Janess, talking to Beth, the DA, and Beth was talking about a possible hearing date of February. And so they're not going to have an investigative grand jury that goes months and months and months. This feels like a real grand jury that could lead to an indictment.
Let me, if there was some kind of a betting line where you could bet on stuff, I would put a ton of money on the fact that there is no way this is an investigative grand jury. Beth Silverman is not over there to do an investigation. She's out of major crimes. They're not assigning Beth to investigate anything. That's maybe one of the biggest jokes I've ever heard. I've known her since she was, I've said this before, since she was a baby DA. She has risen to the pinnacle in that office. She's a force to be reckoned with. And they usually, if you're the grand jury advisor, apologies to a number of them that I have loved over the years, but that is a place for rest and recreation. It's like sitting in Department 30 in arraignment court. That's not where you're going to sit there and put somebody like Beth. So this is,
I agree.
And I've also heard that one of the reasons that this seems to be going so long is precisely what you reported earlier. This friction between the ME and the LAPD has reached levels I have never seen. And
I haven't either.
That is causing enormous problems because they've got an investigation. There is, by all accounts, the LAPD is not on board, so to speak, with where the ME is.
Well, what I'm told is that from our sources, I think what they've ruled from the ME, although I got a caveat here, is that cause of death is undetermined because of the condition of the body. I don't know whether the toxicology is in. It has to be in by now because her body was found in early September. And that's all on lockdown. I'm assuming the LAPD knows about the tox report, but I don't think the LAPD wants this to be viewed as an undetermined cause of death. They are viewing it as a murder. I got to tell you one other thing, and this to me may be the biggest thing, that on Wednesday, Beth walked out into the hallway and talked to Evan Janess. And my reporter, again, was 12 plus feet away, but heard it. And Beth was saying she was going to get a body attachment for a female witness to show up in court, which for people who don't know, it essentially means you find them, you arrest them, and you take them to court.
Right. It's like a bench warrant for a witness. That's why they call it a body attachment. Bring me the body.
So help me out here, because to me, Evan Janess, who represents Robert Morgenroth, who is the day-to-day manager of David, that Evan Janess also apparently represents this woman who is a no-show at the grand jury. So it would seem to me, unless this is remarkably coincidental, that this woman and Morgenroth have some connection. Whether she also works for this management company, I don't know. But, it would be remarkably coincidental if Morgenroth has nothing to do with this woman and that one lawyer represents both of them.
So what happens often in grand jury proceedings, you don't see it as often in the state court, because the state court, as you know, in California, does not use the grand jury like where I'm sitting in New York, where they use the grand jury basically instead of a preliminary hearing. But what happens in grand jury defense work is whoever is the lawyer for the target, and we know who that is in this case,
right.
The lawyer for the target wants to have a joint defense agreement so they know what the heck is going on in that grand jury. So what they do is they may reach out and suggest that people go to lawyer A, lawyer B, lawyer C, and have those people under a joint defense agreement. And that way they know, in this case, whoever the lawyer is in the hallway may have one or more witnesses under a joint defense agreement. And as they're getting marched in and out, you can't get between the lawyer and the witness because that's attorney-client. And then the lawyer for the witness is under a joint defense agreement with the lawyer for the defendant. And therefore, you're at least doing a parallel investigation and you know what is happening inside of the grand jury in real time so that you can keep your investigation going, because I guarantee you there's an investigation going on by the defense.
In this case, the lawyer for the witness, Robert Morgenroth, is the same lawyer that's representing David. They're two different lawyers.
Correct.
But
I'll bet you that those two different lawyers are under a joint defense agreement.
Maybe, but it would seem to me that Evan Janess, Morgenroth's lawyer, also representing this woman who's uncooperative, it just feels like there's some connection between that woman and Robert Morgenroth.
You know, the guys who pioneered this were the ex-AUSAs, on the federal side where they do almost exclusively grand juries. You know, when's the last time you saw a preliminary hearing in the federal court? But ex-AUSAs, I always tease, have the secret club where they've got the usual suspects that march in during grand jury proceedings, all under a joint defense. And the ex-AUSA club is, okay, you represent these number of witnesses and I'll represent the target or the subject, and then we'll peel off at a certain point when the current AUSA who is targeting them decides to kind of eeny, meeny, miny, mo who they're going to indict.
So if they are doing this right now before the grand jury, and it's not an investigative grand jury, it would seem to me that the investigation is complete enough that they can go for an indictment, correct?
Correct. And I think anybody who died, that's the only thing I push back on that doesn't make any sense to me as to why they would wait until February, unless there's some sophisticated toxicology, which could be that they have to do. Because remember, if you've got a heavily decomposed body, the idea of trying to determine the cause of death becomes as complicated as the body decomposes. There are all kinds of problems with that. There's all kinds of problems that happen as a natural devolution of the body and the biology. And so they may be trying to do some kind of sophisticated forensic analysis, because I believe they've already gathered all of the electronic and the kind of trail, if you will, and they know who was where when. And so they've got a pretty good idea of who they think is responsible. And that's why they're zeroing in. And that's also, by the way, if they're giving immunity, that means they pretty much ruled out that person on a variety of levels for having any criminal culpability on the bigger crimes, and they're just rolling them over on maybe the disposal, the movement, things that they're not worried about getting kind of coming around and boomeranging on them.
What I don't understand about what you just said is that if they're waiting for a sophisticated toxicology report, why would they convene the grand jury and really bring it in for a landing and then just say, now we got to wait for this tox report? Wouldn't they wait for the report, present all the evidence, and then presumably try and get an indictment without a break?
No, I think they've got a pretty good look. I'm going to tell you, it would be shocking to me if they didn't have a pretty good idea of what they think happened, what they believe they know happened, how it happened, when it happened, and now they're just backfilling the proof. And that's based on the fact that they have as I said, they've got, by all accounts, an incredible timeline that they've already created electronically or based on devices and based on people posting certain things. They've got that timeline. They also have kind of video evidence, not just people keep talking about the Tesla, but they've already canvassed. I've been on the receiving end of this with LAPD. They do a remarkable job of getting surrounding cameras, surveillance, ring cameras, things of that nature, piecing them together in terms of a timeline. They've already done all of that. They know exactly what they think happened. That's why I said when I started that, and maybe why it was confusing, I pushed back against the February, because the more they learn, if what I'm saying is true and the witnesses' lawyers are communicating with target's lawyers, they know what's going on in that grand jury. It does not take any kind of a sophisticated lawyer to figure out how close they are to pulling the trigger.
So, we talked about this with respect to the LAPD, that they believe there is at least one other suspect. Based on a couple of things that I've heard, I think Beth is more than at that point as well, believing that there's somebody else involved. And I think she's not necessarily satisfied that it's just one other person. This is the sense I'm getting. And I don't know that for a fact, but based on some information that I'm getting, it feels like she has not honed in just on a person or two people, that this could be broader than that. And that's the sense I'm getting from our intel.
Right. And by the way, it's also more traditionally in the federal than the state, but to cast a wider net so that you get somebody to kind of give up the information and roll on the others. And we had heard before that it was two. Yeah, but now they've expanded that, and they've
And
expanded
there's a reason, by the way, Mark, I'm saying this. I can't say it, but I believe that
you and I
she is
both
not
know what. Yeah,
she is not limited it to just two.
right. And you and I both know why that is. And you and I both know that when she's asking the questions, she being the prosecutor, and she's asking certain questions, that's because, a good lawyer, a good trial lawyer, and she certainly is, knows the answer. And if somebody's not giving them a straight answer, she's going to know it. And that's why she's getting, how should I say, she's taking it to another level.
So help me out here. So you have a situation where this body supposedly, well, we don't know, but we know David took a mysterious trip to Santa Barbara and then spent a couple of hours in a remote area. So do you think they've pieced together? Because look, let's talk about what everybody is whispering, and not even whispering, saying. They believe David had something to do with this, and they believe that David may have done something with the body in Santa Barbara. But then the question is, if he did, and we don't know, but if he did, how does the body end up in his Tesla in Los Angeles? You're saying the LAPD knows this. I mean, that is a lot to put together.
Well, I think they not only know it, I think that became the thing. You talk about the type of death, so to speak, whether it's a homicide, whether it's undetermined, or
well, they're considering it a murder.
Yeah, clearly they are. They're also, as you remember, this unbelievable ME saying that fingertips were waterlogged and were consistent with being frozen, and the LAPD coming out and just absolutely saying that's not true.
They told us our story. They told us our story was wrong, and then we've actually seen that in writing they say that they couldn't take the fingerprints off of Celeste because of waterlogged fingers. So right. There you go.
And by the way, so there are, unless they're considering this a drowning, the supposition by the ME was that the body was partially frozen, and partially frozen is why you had waterlogged fingers.
That's what we're told. So yeah. Okay, Mark, I don't want to get out over my skis on this, but Morgan Roth, when he said Beth got upset with him on why he didn't call the police, and he said, "Not my responsibility." And then when you pair that with what I believe to be true, which is Beth is not only limiting this to two suspects, what's sounding like to me is that whatever was happening was known, but not that other people participated necessarily, but some of this was known to other people, allegedly in David's world.
Correct.
And
That's
that's the way
right.
this is feeling to me.
That's exactly the same kind of reaction I had, that she knows because people had talked. She's got her sights on more than just one or two people. And by the way, I gave you immunity, Mr. Witness, and you need to tell me why you didn't call, because I think I know why you didn't call, and you're not being forthcoming to me. So what does that tell you?
Now, I will say that, because we want to be very transparent here, that this manager has been the manager for around 4 years. And David was on 2 other tours, in addition to the one that he was on when Celeste's body was discovered in his car. But it would seem to me this has to have to do with the September tour, because otherwise, why would Beth be interested in something 2 years before?
Oh, and by the way, I'm as you know, I make my living out of the presumption of innocence. The fact that the person is in there, whether they've got immunity or not, speaks volumes as to that person thinking, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm in there. I've been either given immunity or I've gone in without immunity, which I think is highly unlikely if you've got a lawyer sitting there. But the idea of getting crosswise with the DA, I think, shows that the DA knows or suspects that the witness knows more than they're saying. Why didn't you call police?
Yeah.
Implies, I know why you didn't call the police. I know that you know what had happened and you didn't want to call the police because of the dominoes that were going to start falling. I mean, this is not, I know it's a kind of I hate to say it, a murder mystery, but this
Oh, it
is
is.
it is a homicide. At least that's what they are proceeding on. They think, the law enforcement thinks they know who was responsible. They think other people outside of who was responsible quickly knew what was happening and stood by and didn't do anything, which is hence the question, why didn't you call police? Because if you called police, you were going to jeopardize A, B, or C. And why don't you just admit that? And you're not telling me the truth. And therefore, I'm going to drag you down to 123 and threaten your immunity agreement.
So, yeah, I mean, it's not hard to make a connection here, because Morgan Roth's answer to Beth when she asked, why didn't you call police, was, didn't feel it was my responsibility. My responsibility was to make sure the tour went on. I don't think it's a big leap to think that maybe he thought that if he did call the police, the tour would be in jeopardy. So that's the only connection that I can make, that whatever Beth felt he should call the police about, that information could have jeopardized the continuation of David's tour, right?
We're both saying the same thing, that she has a theory as to what actually happened. He's not being forthright as to why he didn't call. He may be completely 100% honest when he says, my concern was the tour and I'm not the police. And he would be technically legally right. If he heard something that happened and he didn't call the police and he wanted to make sure the tour happened, there isn't a snitch rule for witnesses.
Well, I think, put a different way, there is no legal responsibility he has to notify the police, even if he knew something criminal was going on with David. There's no duty imposed on a tour manager or any manager to call the police, especially if there was a crime that had already happened. But whatever it is, I don't see any legal duty on Morgan Roth's part. Do you?
No, I don't. And by the way, the only legal duty is whether he's complying with an immunity agreement. If he's not answering a question or he's obfuscating, in her opinion, right? And this is one of the problems. And I always explain to people when they get into immunity agreements, that the whole expression of a perjury trap is you get immunity, you go in front of a grand jury, you don't say what they want you to say. Famously, I've had the only two witnesses that I can remember in the last 40 years who've done that and said, I'd rather go to jail than sing your script.
Susan McDougal.
Susan McDougal and Greg Anderson in the Barry Bonds-Balco investigation. So those two witnesses were not going to play by the prosecutor's rules. And that is the downside of taking immunity. If you don't hew to what they think the story is, you're at risk.
So explain this to me. If you're right and they offered Morgan Roth immunity, or they gave him immunity, why does he need immunity if he had no legal duty to talk to the police? I don't get it.
I wouldn't have, there's no way I would have let this guy, my client, go in there without an immunity agreement. No way.
Why?
Because anything he knows, other than, and by the way, he's already confirmed that, at least reportedly from the hallway discussions, because when you have to say, I didn't think it was my duty, when somebody's asking the question, why didn't you? That's enough to trigger any sentient criminal defense lawyer to say, you're not talking unless you've got immunity. That somebody will try to fashion liability on that absent an immunity agreement. By the way, your defense is a jury instruction that says mere presence is not enough, or knowledge of a crime is not enough. Who wants to be on the receiving end of that?
Everything I'm hearing seems to suggest that whatever Beth thinks happened, and clearly she thinks David did this, whatever she thinks happened, there were more than one or more than two people who had some knowledge of it, because everything I'm hearing, based on a reporter there and other information, is that her net is wider than two people. So I think she thinks, and again, I'm connecting dots, and I'm not going to say I know something when I don't, but I'm connecting dots, that I think Beth believes that a circle around David knew various things. Does that make sense to you?
That's exactly what I think is happening. I think not only two or three, I think there are as many as 8 different people who were in the orbit who had heard or had witnessed what had happened. And they are basically casting that net, trying to get closer to the center of that circle.
So the joke is that a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. If the LAPD
except if it's Tish James, but other than that, yes.
Okay. Nice deviation. But if in this case, everything we're told is that the LAPD believes they have hard evidence against David. That doesn't mean he did it. It's just that they believe it. And so if they believe it and they have evidence, they have data from the Tesla, they have ring phone video, they have witnesses and whatever else.
They've got surveillance footage.
If they have all of that, even if the ME comes back with an undetermined cause of death and nothing particularly helpful with toxicology, that would not prevent an indictment, would it?
No, I mean, take a look at, my friend Matt Murphy, who used to be an Orange County DA. I think Matt has done in his day, prosecuted 5 no-body cases. I'm old enough to remember, you're old enough to remember J. Miller Levy, who was a legend in the LADA's office, who made his career on a no-body case. If you can get a conviction on a no-body case, you can get a conviction on a no evidence, no direct evidence case.
Do you think David's going to get indicted?
Do I? I wouldn't start betting on that. I don't think I'm there yet.
Really?
Yeah,
what's giving you hesitation?
My hesitation is that the the split between the ME and the LAPD is an opening for a defense lawyer that is, it's almost unheard of to have that kind of a public split. The last time I can remember anything like that happening was a case that had nowhere near this profile, but it involved Cyril Wecht, the late great Cyril Wecht, in Pennsylvania, who was the elected coroner, and he had gotten sideways with the prosecuting authorities. It's very rare. You have to understand, people who work in this area will tell you there's usually a very symbiotic relationship between the coroner and law enforcement. And by the way, which I always will plumb, because one of the things that you often find is that the ME or the representative will kind of tailor their conclusion based upon what a detective is feeding them, which is unfair, which is not science. That's junk science. So this is really a stark contrast and something that is extremely rare, and I think fascinating to not just practitioners, but the public, obviously.
Well, except that's something that comes up at trial when the defense puts on its case. For a grand jury, they're not going to know anything about this dispute. So again, I ask, do you think this grand jury is going to indict David?
I think this grand jury very well could. I mean, if you're asking me that, I think that the grand jury very well could. But remember, if the defense is as savvy as I think they are, I bet you they already have a private pathologist taking a look at stuff and analyzing everything that's happened. They've gone even farther than that. So it would not surprise me if there is a lot going on that we don't know from the defense standpoint.
I'll leave you with this. I think bigger than that is that if David gets indicted, the biggest argument they got is, why is somebody doing something to a body in Santa Barbara, and then months later it ends up in his Tesla at his home when he's on tour? Why would somebody who committed murder do something that ridiculous?
You want me to respond?
Sure.
If the clients made good decisions, they wouldn't need their lawyers.
Oh. See you next week.
See you then. Bye.